At the kitchen table, I opened a letter Emma never wanted me to find. It had been tucked between a grocery coupon packet and a folded utility bill, like something she meant to move before I got home. Her handwriting was on the front. Neat. Careful. The kind she used for birthday cards, thank you notes, and anything she thought mattered enough to slow down for. I knew that handwriting better than I knew my own some days. I sat down without thinking. Morning light was coming in across the table, catching the wood grain and the coffee ring from the mug I'd left there the night before. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of our dog shifting around in the living room. I opened the letter with my thumb, slow enough not to tear it. Last night changed everything. That was the first line. I didn't get any farther right away, because my eyes dropped lower and caught on the name. Not mine. Jake. Jake from across the street. The neighbor who borrowed my ladder 2 weeks earlier and brought it back with a six-pack like we were the kind of men who still did things that way. Jake, who waved from his driveway like he belonged here. Jake, who had somehow become familiar enough that seeing his truck outside no longer meant anything to me. Until it did. I kept staring at the name like it might rearrange itself if I gave it enough time. Like maybe I was still half asleep and reading it wrong. But I wasn't. It stayed there, clean and final in Emma's handwriting. Jake. In that moment, something inside me stopped. Not my breathing. Not my thoughts. Something deeper than that. Something structural. The quiet belief that whatever happened in this house still belonged to the life I thought I was living. I remember setting the letter flat on the table and looking around the kitchen like I was seeing it from outside myself. Her coffee mug in the sink. My laptop bag by the wall. The dog bed near the pantry. Every ordinary thing still in place. And none of it felt normal anymore. We lived in Boise, Idaho. The kind of place where everything looked the same if you drove through it too fast. Rows of identical houses, trimmed lawns, fences that marked space without really creating distance. In the mornings, people waved whether they knew you or not. It was the kind of neighborhood that made routine feel like stability. Emma liked that. She worked at a clinic on the north side of town. Early shifts, predictable hours, stories about patients she only half told me over dinner. I worked remotely in IT, which meant most of my world existed behind a screen and inside scheduled calls. We had a rhythm that didn't require much discussion anymore. Wake up, coffee, work, dinner, TV, sleep. Repeat. We had a dog too. A golden retriever that filled the quiet spaces between conversations we no longer needed to have. He waited by the door when she got home, sat under the table during dinner, and slept at our feet like something steady we didn't have to think about. It all worked because nothing was questioned. Jake moved in across the street sometime in early spring. I remember because I helped him unload a couch the day he arrived. He was easy to talk to. The kind of guy who didn't hesitate to step into a conversation like he'd already been part of it. At first, it was small things. He borrowed tools, returned them clean, stayed for a beer on the porch, talked about work, about the house, about nothing in particular. Emma seemed comfortable around him right away. More than comfortable, actually. Familiar, like she didn't need time to adjust. I noticed it, but I didn't name it. When I mentioned he was around a lot, she smiled it off. You're overthinking, she said. He's just being neighborly. That word, neighborly, was enough to close the conversation. After that, I stopped pointing things out. That's when her volunteer meetings started. Evenings at first, then later evenings. Then nights where dinner sat untouched until it got cold, and I packed it away without asking when she'd be back. She always had an explanation ready. A fundraiser. A planning session. Something that sounded reasonable if you didn't follow it too closely. I didn't follow. Not because I trusted her completely. Because I understood something quieter than trust. If I looked too closely, I might find something I couldn't ignore. And at the time, it felt easier to keep living inside a version of things that still made sense. The letter stayed on the table longer than it should have. I didn't rush to read the rest of it. There was no urgency left in me for that. Whatever it said beyond those first lines didn't feel like information I needed to chase. The important part had already surfaced on its own. Her handwriting. His name. That was enough. I sat there for a while, hands resting on the table, looking at nothing in particular. And slowly, without effort, things began to line up. Not in a dramatic way. Not all at once. Just small pieces shifting into place, like they had been waiting for a reason to make sense. Her late nights. At first, they had explanations. Then they became patterns. Same days. Same timing. Always just far enough outside routine to seem reasonable if you didn't compare them too closely. The way her replies changed. Shorter, cleaner, like she was managing time instead of having a conversation. I remembered sending messages during the day and getting back responses that felt efficient, not cold, just reduced, like something else had her attention, and I was being handled in between. Her phone, always face down, not aggressively, not in a way that would start a fight, just consistent enough that it became normal, a quiet adjustment I accepted without realizing I had. And Jake, that part settled differently. He had stopped coming over weeks ago. No more beers on the porch. No more casual drop-ins. At the time, I told myself it was just routine shifting. People get busy. Conversations fade. But his truck didn't disappear. I started remembering where I'd seen it. Not directly in front of his house, but down the street. Around the corner. Parked where it didn't draw attention unless you were already looking for it. I hadn't been looking. Now I was. And the pattern was there, fully formed, like it had been building quietly while I chose not to notice. I didn't get up to check anything. Didn't go through her things. Didn't open the rest of the letter. I didn't need confirmation. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. There's a point where searching becomes unnecessary, where the absence of denial is enough to define the truth. I leaned back in the chair and let that settle. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just a kind of clarity that removed the need for questions. Everything I had avoided putting together was already complete. I just hadn't allowed myself to see it until now. I folded the letter along the same crease it already had. Carefully. Precisely. The way you handle something that isn't yours anymore. Then I slid it back between the coupon packet and the utility bill, exactly where I'd found it. Not to protect her. Not to preserve anything. Just to return the moment to its place, like it hadn't happened yet. There was no urge to confront her. No impulse to call, to ask, to demand an explanation that would only rearrange what I already understood. Whatever conversation could come from this would be built on timing, on what she thought I knew, on what she believed she could still control. I wasn't interested in that version of things. Something else had already shifted. It didn't feel dramatic. There was no clear dividing line, no internal speech marking the change. Just a quiet withdrawal, like stepping back from something that had already ended, even if the structure was still standing. I got up, rinsed my coffee mug, and set it in the rack. Routine stayed intact. That was the part that mattered. When she came home that evening, I was sitting in the same place I usually was. Laptop open. Work still on the screen. The dog lifted his head when the door opened, tail thumping against the floor in a slow, familiar rhythm. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag near the chair. "Hey." My voice didn't change. I made sure of that. She moved through the kitchen like she always did. Opened the fridge. Looked inside without really seeing anything. Closed it again. The small, habitual movements of someone who expects the environment to stay consistent. I watched without watching. "How was your day?" she asked, turning slightly toward me. "Normal," I said. "Yours?" "Busy. Meetings ran late." The answer came easily. Practiced, but not rehearsed. The kind of response that had been used enough times to become automatic. I nodded once, like it was enough. And it was. We moved through the rest of the evening without friction. Dinner was simple. Conversation stayed on the surface. Work, a comment about the weather, something the neighbor down the street had done with his yard. Nothing that required depth. At one point, she smiled at something I said. It looked the same as it always had. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. It didn't matter anymore. Because the part of me that used to respond to it, to measure it, to interpret it, was no longer involved. I wasn't pretending nothing had changed. I was operating as if it had already ended. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to hold anything together. In the following days, I didn't change anything. That was intentional. I kept my schedule the same. Woke up at the same time. Made coffee the same way. Logged into work, answered messages, joined calls. From the outside, nothing shifted. If anything, I became more consistent, more predictable. There's a kind of clarity that comes from not reacting. It creates space. And in that space, things reveal themselves without pressure. She continued her meetings. Same pattern. She'd leave just after dinner, keys in hand, offering a quick explanation before I could even ask. Not rushed, not nervous, just efficient. like she was maintaining a routine that had already been accepted. I would nod, sometimes say okay, sometimes nothing at all. Then I would wait. About 20 minutes after she left, Jake's house would change. At first, it was just the lights. One room, then another. Not all at once. Gradual, like someone moving through the space with purpose. I started noticing the timing matched too closely to ignore. On the third night, I stepped outside. Not to investigate, just to stand on the porch, hands in my pockets, looking across the street like I had a reason to be there. His driveway was empty, but I already knew that. I walked to the edge of the yard and looked down the street. About halfway to the corner, partially hidden under a tree, his pickup sat angled toward the curb, parked just far enough away to avoid attention from anyone not paying close attention. I went back inside. No reaction. No conclusion spoken out loud. Just another piece settling into place. A few days later, I saw them together for the first time. It wasn't planned. I had driven out to pick up something from a hardware store on the edge of town. On the way back, I passed the old movie theater, the one that had been closed for years, sitting empty with faded posters still trapped behind glass. That's where I saw her car, parked along the side, where no one had any reason to be. I didn't slow down much, just enough. She was standing near the back of the building, laughing, not loudly, but freely, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in a while. Jake stood close to her, not touching, not obviously, but close enough that there was no space left for interpretation. I kept driving, didn't circle back, didn't stop, because at that point, nothing I could see would change anything I already understood. What mattered wasn't the moment. It was the pattern, and the pattern was too precise to be accidental. It didn't stay contained to the house. That was the part one hadn't accounted for at first. I thought if I kept everything internal, observed, controlled, quiet, it would remain isolated. Something I could process without it spilling into the rest of my life. It doesn't work that way. Things like this have a way of leaking through the edges. I started noticing it in small interactions. Neighbors who used to wave without hesitation began holding their gaze a second too long. Not obvious. Not enough to confront. Just enough to register. A pause. A calculation. Like they were placing something they had seen or heard into context. Across the street, Jake's curtains stayed drawn more often during the day. His routine shifted slightly, leaving earlier, coming back later. Not disappearing, just adjusting. It wasn't secrecy, it was awareness. At work, it showed up differently. I'd be on a call, someone explaining a process or asking a question, and I'd realize halfway through that I hadn't followed anything they said. My responses became automatic, structured, enough to pass, but disconnected. One of my colleagues noticed. We were wrapping up a meeting when he paused and said, "You good?" Simple question. No weight behind it. I nodded. Yeah, just a long week. He held the look for a second, like he was deciding whether to ask more. Then he let it go. That was the first time I understood this wasn't just something happening to me. It was something I was carrying into everything else. The routines were still there, calls, tasks, deadlines, but they no longer anchored anything. They were just movements. Necessary, but empty of the meaning they used to hold. Even the house felt different during the day. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More like a space that had lost its structure. I'd walk through it between calls and notice things I hadn't paid attention to before. The placement of her shoes by the door. The way her jacket hung slightly off-center on the rack. Small details that used to blend into the background. Now they stood out. Not because they mattered, but because everything else had lost its context. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop before a call started. For a second, I didn't recognize the expression. Not tired. Not angry. Just removed. Like I was watching my own life from a step back, waiting for it to resolve into something final. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just about her. Or Jake. Or what had happened. It was about the shift that comes when something foundational gives way, and everything built on top of it has to adjust, whether you want it to or not. And I was already adjusting. Quietly. Completely. Without saying a word. I knocked on Jake's door early in the morning. Not early enough to be strange, but earlier than people usually expect visitors. The kind of time where routines are still settling. Coffee not finished, plans not fully in motion. It leaves less room for preparation. I stood there with the folded letter in my hand. Not clenched. Not hidden. Just held. When he opened the door, he looked surprised. Not alarmed. Not guilty. just caught off guard in a way that didn't immediately confirm anything. "Hey," he said, like he needed a second to place why I was there. "Morning," I replied. My voice stayed level. No edge to it. He stepped back slightly, as if he was about to invite me in, but I didn't move. I stayed where I was, keeping the distance exactly where it needed to be. "She writes you letters," I said. No build-up. No explanation. I held out the folded page. For a moment, he didn't take it. His eyes moved from my face to the letter, then back again, like he was trying to understand what version of this interaction he had stepped into. Then he reached out and took it. He unfolded it slowly. Careful, the same way I had. I watched his face while he read. That was the only thing I was there for. At first, nothing. Just recognition of the handwriting, the structure, the context. Then something shifted. Subtle, but clear enough once you were looking for it. Not pride. Not defensiveness. Confusion. It showed up in the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his mouth paused mid-breath like something didn't align with what he expected to see. He read further, then stopped, looked back down at the page, then up at me. There was a gap there, small, but real. "You didn't know everything, did you?" I asked. I didn't raise my voice, didn't step closer. The question wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The silence did what words would have complicated. He folded the letter back, slower this time, like he was recalibrating something internally. His posture had changed slightly, not defensive, not open, just uncertain. That was enough for me. I nodded once, not as acknowledgement, but as closure. Then I turned and walked back down the path. No argument, no accusations, because whatever existed between them wasn't as simple as I had initially thought. And whatever it was already starting to come apart on its own. I didn't go back to the house with any urgency. There was no sense of confrontation waiting for me, no scene to prepare for. Whatever needed to happen had already started moving, and it didn't require my involvement to continue. That was the shift. I wasn't part of the center anymore. I was just someone who had stepped outside of it. Emma noticed first. Not immediately, but quickly enough. The change wasn't in what I did, it was in what I stopped doing. I didn't ask where she was going. Didn't follow up on her explanations. Didn't fill the space with questions she had already prepared answers for. At first, she treated it like relief. Less friction, fewer conversations, an easier version of the same routine. But that didn't last. By the third day, she started watching me more closely. It showed in small ways. The way she lingered in the doorway before leaving. The way she paused mid-sentence, like she expected a reaction that didn't come. The way she checked my face when I answered, looking for something to confirm she still understood where I stood. There was nothing there for her to read. That's when the question started. "Are you okay? Did something happen at work?" "You've been quiet." Each one delivered carefully. Measured. Not direct enough to expose anything, but pointed enough to test the surface. I answered all of them the same way. "I'm fine." And I meant it. Not in the way she was asking, but in the only way that mattered now. The explanations followed after that. Unprompted. She started filling silence with information I hadn't asked for. Details about her meetings. Names of people involved. Small, unnecessary specifics meant to reinforce the version of reality she was still trying to maintain. It came too quickly, too complete. Like she was building something in real time, trying to stay ahead of a question that never arrived. I let her, because the absence of pressure did something more effective than confrontation ever could. It removed her ability to control the timing. Without resistance, everything she said stood on its own. No argument to push against. No reaction to reshape. Just her words, existing without support. And slowly, that started to unravel her. The timing of her meetings shifted. Not consistently, just enough to show adjustment. She came home earlier one night, later the next. Her phone stayed in her hand more often. Conversations became uneven, starting normally, then trailing off when she realized I wasn't engaging the way I used to. She tried to pull me back in once. Sat across from me at the table, same place I had opened the letter. "We should talk," she said. I looked up, held her gaze for a second, then nodded slightly. "About what?" That was the moment. I watched it land. Because for the first time, she didn't have a prepared answer. And that's when I knew things were moving faster than she could manage. Not because of anything I did, but because I had stepped out of the version of the story she still believed she could control. A few weeks later, I sat at the same kitchen table. Same chair. Same angle of morning light coming through the window. The same faint mark on the wood where a cup had once sat too long and left a ring that never fully disappeared. Everything looked unchanged, but the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence. Not the hollow kind that echoes. This was different. Settled. Still. Like something that had been in motion for too long had finally come to rest. Emma was gone. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. There was no single moment where things broke apart. It happened the same way everything else had, gradually, without resistance. After that conversation at the table, the one that never fully started, something in her shifted. The explanations stopped coming as quickly. The routines lost their structure. She spent less time trying to maintain the version of things we had been living in. And then, one morning, she packed a bag. Not everything. Just enough. She stood in the doorway for a second, like she was deciding whether to say something that would make it feel complete. Something final. I stayed where I was. Not waiting. Not expecting. Just present. I'll be at my sister's for a while, she said. I nodded once. No questions. No attempt to hold her there. She waited a moment longer, maybe expecting something else. A reaction. A reason to stay in the conversation. There wasn't one. So she left. The door closed with the same quiet click it always made. No weight behind it. No emphasis. Just a sound that marked a transition already finished. After that, the house adjusted quickly. Her things remained where they were at first. Shoes by the door. A jacket on the rack. A mug in the cabinet that I didn't move. Not out of attachment. Just because there was no need to change anything immediately. The dog settled into the new pattern faster than I expected. Fewer footsteps to follow. Fewer sounds to respond to. He slept more during the day. I kept my routine. Work. Meals. Evenings. But without the background layer of something unresolved. There were no more patterns to observe. No more timing to track. No conversations waiting beneath the surface. Just space. And for the first time in a long time, sitting at that table didn't feel like holding something together. It felt like nothing needed to be held at all. Sometimes, it doesn't take a confrontation. Not a fight. Not a confession. Not even a full explanation. Just one moment that doesn't fit the version of reality you've been maintaining. For me, it was a letter. A single page, written carefully, meant for someone else. Not hidden well enough. Not destroyed in time. Just misplaced long enough for the truth to surface without effort. And once it did, everything else followed. Not because I chased it. Because I stopped avoiding it. Looking back, there wasn't a point where things suddenly broke. The structure had been shifting long before I allowed myself to see it. Small changes. Adjustments. Patterns that didn't belong to the life I thought I was still part of. I just chose not to name them. Until I couldn't ignore them anymore. What surprised me wasn't what happened between her and Jake. It was how little noise it took for everything to end. No raised voices. No final argument. Just distance. Clarity. And the quiet decision to step out of something that no longer required my presence to continue. People think closure comes from answers. It doesn't. It comes from recognizing when there's nothing left to ask. And sometimes, that recognition is enough. Enough to walk away. Without a word. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.